In this clip, what we're going to be looking at is the latter prophets. And these are the ones that we know better because these are the ones that we particularly know as the prophets, the latter prophets. But we need to also realize that even these need to be divided into 3 time periods, because there's really 3 periods in which the latter prophets are doing their prophecy. The first period is what we could call the 8th century prophets. And these are the prophets that are prophesying when Israel is still there. So the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is called Judah, are still both intact. It's the rise of the Assyrian period. So it's the period when the main empire that's beginning to take precedence within the area of the Middle East is the Assyrians, kind of in modern day Syria. And what they're doing is that they're beginning to grow and develop, and it's in the midst of this time that the first written prophets begin to happen. We talked about in the last clip about Elijah and Elisha. They were part of that prophecy that's still in the former prophets. They didn't write, but rather were part of the historical context of Israel. The writing now begins in these first section of these 8th century prophets. And the 4 8th century prophets, 2 of them were prophesying to that northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 of them were prophesying to the southern kingdom of Judah. So the 2 to the northern kingdom were Amos and Hosea. Now, to remind you of the intensive that we did where we looked at the history of Israel, you'll remember, I'm hoping, that what happened with the nation of Israel under David and Solomon is that when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over. And instead of taking the advice of the northern nobles and actually lowering the tax, he decided to do just the opposite and increase the tax. And of course, the northern part of Israel the northern part of the kingdom decided, no, we're not going to have this anymore. We're going to split. We're going to have a civil war between the north and the south. And the north then broke away under a general. And his general, of course, was Jeroboam. Now, you can understand that Jeroboam very quickly realized, but hang on a second. The focal point of this people is God. And they meet God in the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, the temple in Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom of Judah. If that's the case, what we do is we have to set up an alternate place of worship. And not just an alternate place of worship, but an alternate to worship. And that's what he does. So he sets up an altar in Samaria. He sets it up here in that northern kingdom, Mount Gerizim. And so it's there that immediately, right from the time of the split of the 2 empires, that the northern kingdom begins to now cultivate a relationship with the gods around them. So no longer are they worshiping Yahweh and Yahweh exclusively. They're now also worshiping the other gods around them. So, for example, sometimes they use the word Baal. However, Baal really isn't the name of a god. Rather, Baal is the name master, so an other master. And they begin to worship these fertility gods and these others who connect with that. Now, what we see then is that they immediately go into what we call apostasy, or they go connected to somebody else rather than to Yahweh, to other gods. And so they immediately go into that position of being outside of the covenant, outside of the relationship of Torah. And it's in the midst of that these 2 prophets go and speak to them. We've got Amos, who is in fact a southerner, going to speak to the northern kingdom. And so you can imagine how well received he would be. And Hosea. And both of them have a chilling message for the north. And essentially that message is turn or burn. Saying either come back to Yahweh, stop worshipping these other gods, or you are going to be destroyed. Now, the fact that the northern kingdom was destroyed is not because Amos and Hosea prophesied it, because their prophecy was always a conditional prophecy. And we can see that particularly in the person of Hosea, because Hosea's entire life becomes a parable of God's relationship with that northern kingdom. Hosea, a God-fearing man, is told to go and marry a prostitute. Now, she's not just any kind of prostitute. Generally, what we believe is that Gomer was a temple prostitute. What that means is that she was part of the religious institution that was the very symbol of the heresy that had come into Judaism in the north. She was a symbol of that. And so by Hosea going to Gomer and saying, we want to marry you, and then buying her from the temple, actually is a symbol of God saying, this is what I want to do as well. I want to buy you back from your apostasy. I want to buy you back from these other gods so that you will worship me again, so that you will be back into relationship with me. Of course, as we keep reading the book of Hosea, we see that Gomer actually goes back again, goes back to her old life. And Hosea has to go back again and try and buy her back. But then the prophecy ends. And we never find out whether Gomer actually came back. Although what we can see from the historical perspective is that the northern kingdom is destroyed. And so it really becomes the tragic symbol and the tragic fulfillment of the fact that they didn't turn back to God. And so the outcome of that was destruction, was separation and complete separation from God. And so we see that Hosea and Amos, the symbols are very simple, and that is come back, come back. But if you don't come back, then you are living outside of the boundaries of blessing and you're becoming part of curse. The other two prophets of this time are called Proto-Isaiah and Micah. Now, these two prophets prophesy in the southern kingdom. Now, proto means first Isaiah. The reason why we call it Proto-Isaiah is because there's a group of scholars who believe that Isaiah is not actually one book, but rather at least two or possibly even three books. And what that means is that instead of being written by one man, Isaiah is written by rather a community of prophets, a community that would come around maybe this man called Isaiah and then continue to write in his name. Now, again, for us, we may say, well, isn't that false? Isn't that saying one thing but doing something else? But again, we need to understand context. In the context of the Middle East, very often books were ascribed to somebody famous, to somebody well-known, because it was written in the spirit of their thinking, of their perspective. As we've seen with Torah, the 5 books are named after Moses, even though it was highly unlikely that Moses wrote any of the first 5 books. They attribute it to him because he is seen to be the father of the law, the father of Torah. In the same way, Isaiah is seen as even though the book is one book, it's really seen to be connected into at least 2 or 3 hands or groups of hands that have put Isaiah together. Now, Proto-Isaiah, which begins round about chapter 6 with the call of Isaiah, is really written during this period of the 8th century. And what we see is that the southern kingdom is still following God. They're still trying to do the right thing by God. But what we see is that there's an indulgence now. They've lived high on the hog for a long time. They've had prosperity and they've had peace. And the problem with all those things is that they begin to forget the things of God. They begin to forget the things that God wants them to do and to be. And that's why we get in Micah, for example, particularly an encouragement to go back to what they knew to be true, to move away from religion and back to faith, to move away from just the blessing on themselves and move back to the blessing that they are meant to be to others. And so we see both of those elements within Proto-Isaiah and within the book of Micah as the connections. So you see that at this period of prophecy, there's 2 very different themes. The one theme to the north is turn or burn, and to the south is turn back. Come back into a full relationship and a connection with God. But do you see how the context of history and culture now depend on how we then interpret each of those books?